Hi, everybody. Welcome to Ellevate Louisiana's Workforce and Higher Education Committee meeting. I'm Julie Stokes, founder and CEO of Ellevate. Today, we're excited to be joined by researchers from the Blanco Center who will be sharing their insights on LA First and its latest Louisiana Employment Outcomes Report. This topic is especially significant considering how crucial the alignment is between our educational system and the state's workforce needs. LA First is a statewide data system that was created during the 2023 legislative session. It is run by the Blanco Center and is designed to give policymakers better information to guide smart, informed, data-driven decisions. And we're fortunate to have the Louisiana Employment Outcomes Report authors here with us today, Dr. Robert Havens and Jenna Losh. Dr. Havens is a research scientist at the Blanco Center whose work focuses on employment, place, and local economies. His research has explored workforce trends, wealth inequality, and the implications of Louisiana's energy transition. Senior policy research analyst Jenna Losh has a background in applied mathematics, machine learning, and data analysis. She brings valuable insights to the labor market and education data patterns across the state. Their work offers an in-depth look at the connection between workforce outcomes and post-secondary education across Louisiana. Thank you, Robert and Jenna, for joining us today. We're excited to learn more about your work. So with that, let me go ahead and hand it off to you to get us started.
All right, thanks for the introduction. Give me just 1 second to pull up my slides. So yeah, we're going to talk about employment and higher education in Louisiana. Thanks for the great introduction to LA First as well, Julie. But I'm going to cover a little bit of that too. And if anybody wants a more thorough introduction, actually, I think she's on the call as well. Rachel Veron, the director of LA First, a couple weeks ago in a different Ellevate panel, gave a slightly more thorough introduction. This is going to be the really brief one. Julie already mentioned that this is a very new initiative. The idea is to link existing state administrative data together to answer public policy questions. There's a version of this in a lot of states. The idea is that just as the normal course of business, state agencies collect a lot of information. And if that information is linked longitudinally, you can track people over time. And if it's linked across these data silos, you can track people across systems. And it makes it possible to answer a lot of questions that otherwise would not be available. That legislation provides for 3 reports: the Louisiana Outcomes Report, which is the one we're going to focus on today. There's also one focused on K-12 education and transitions after K-12. That's called Launch Louisiana. And there's one called Causes and Consequences of Criminal and Delinquent Acts, which has a more self-explanatory title. On the right side of the slide, you can see a list of state agencies that are participating. We've hired LA Works, formerly the Workforce Commission, and the Louisiana Board of Regents, because those are the 2 agencies whose data we're going to show you as part of this presentation. So this is the link to the report if you want to read more. I think basically everything we're going to talk about today is in the report and more besides. I also just want to acknowledge the other 2 co-authors on the report. That's Rachel and Stephen Barnes, the director of the Blanco Center. So here's our little outline. The report has a lot of background material. It uses publicly available data from the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That's a nice way to sort of ease into the topic. So we're going to cover some of that. And then we're going to cover some of the very early evidence using actual LA First data that comes from the report. And we'll close with a little bit of a taste of what's coming. I want to stress that there's a lot more in the report besides what we're going to show here. We wanted to walk you through some of the main takeaways. But these are all very preliminary analysis, preliminary data. If we have time for questions and discussion afterward, please feel free to ask us. We might or might not have the answers. But nonetheless, this is great timing for us because it's good to get feedback as we are right now hard at work on the next report. So good timing. To start with employment in Louisiana, the report, we call it the LEO report, so I might kind of slip into the acronym, apologies in advance. But the LEO report focuses on employment outcomes for post-secondary education. That's how much are completers earning, what kinds of jobs do they have, and so on. We're all familiar with Louisiana's labor market challenges. We rank low in wage earnings. We rank low in rates of adult employment. We have a lot of workers in lower paid jobs who might struggle to pay their bills, and the state also struggles to retain people who are in higher paid jobs. Clearly, education and training have a role to play in these issues. But when you start asking questions about employment outcomes of education, it's natural to focus on the characteristics of workers and the attributes they acquire through education and training. It goes something like this. If I get degree X, I can expect to have a career doing Y and expect to earn at least Z. That's important. We're going to show some of that kind of information later in the presentation because we've done a bit of analysis along those lines. However, I think it's also important to emphasize that these are questions that we tend to ask from the supply side of the labor market. That is the supply side of workers and the skills that are contained in the workforce. But demand shapes outcomes too. And just to boil it down very, very simply, demand has been changing in Louisiana, and it's also been somewhat weak for a long time. So I like to start with this slide because it highlights the unique situation of Louisiana over roughly the same time that's covered by the LA First data, from about the middle of the 2010s up to the recent year. Louisiana's had slow growth since the late 1990s, and it's had essentially no growth since 2014. So between 2015 and 2025, US employment grew 12%. Louisiana employment grew by 0.2%. By a similar token, US employment had recovered to what it lost before COVID levels. By 2022, Louisiana only hit that same milestone by early 2025. So we've had essentially no growth over the last decade. This slide is another angle on the same issue. It shows unemployed workers per job opening. This is a measure of how tight or how loose the labor market is. And Louisiana in a typical year is a little lower than the national average, but the important part here is the trend. So we see that big spike during Katrina and Rita. We see a big longer spike for the Great Recession, and we see that big spike during COVID. But if we focus on that time after 2015 to COVID, we actually had this period where it flipped, and Louisiana had a looser labor market than the United States, unusually during that period. So this is the period of the data we show. It covers this, roughly the last 10 years. Big picture, hiring situation in Louisiana hasn't been very strong. And when we do show the outcomes, these are what we're describing.
Robert, can I ask a quick question? So when looking at the slow recovery in jobs, I mean, do you have any concept, and you may not, of how many jobs we would need to add to catch back up with the average of the United States?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know the absolute number. I mean, in a certain sense, that's kind of what this chart is showing. Needless to say, when you see that gap open up after 2015, that gap gets bigger every single year.
Yeah. We'd probably have to add, if it's 140% and 120%, we'd probably have to add 20%. So however many jobs we have, and we would not have enough workers for it.
It would be 20% of whatever the number was in 1991 based on this chart. So I have to look at the numbers to get the exact number. But
interesting though.
Nonetheless, it's a significant amount of jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of variety in different states too. So there are states that have, like Texas, has been adding a lot more jobs. Until 2015, we were like middle of the pack-ish, maybe a little lower. But we've been on the lower end of the rank in terms of like annual job growth since then. I think that's the main takeaway. So this is a little bit about the changing composition of jobs in Louisiana, and this is somewhat less unique to the state. But the composition of jobs is obviously changing. Here we show the share of jobs, not the absolute number, the share of the total. And we're showing just the industry sectors with the most movement. So we see the decline of manufacturing, of natural resources, and of transportation, of retail. And we see the growth of service industries like healthcare, professional and business services, and leisure and hospitality. That was industries, but this is a similar angle. It's on occupation. So that was like the type of business. This is the type of job. And the shifts are also reflected here. We see big changes in managerial and professional workers. These are highly paid jobs. We also see big increases in lower paid services jobs, although these might be leveling off a bit. There's a bit of COVID stuff going on at the end of this chart. But where we've had losses are in so-called middle skill jobs. So that's a lot of blue collar production workers. It's a lot of clerical office jobs. This is a term that it's not a perfect term, but it basically means jobs that require some level of specialized training beyond high school, but less than a 4-year degree. And they're often based on some kind of specialized technical skill set. They're jobs that often pay pretty well for workers without a college degree, but also the kinds of jobs where we see attainable credentials come into play. So stuff like certificates, associates, and diplomas. And it's where a lot of opportunities lie to put workers on a better path. But just all in total, what this means is that the skills in the workforce are evolving, and by extension, so are the education and training requirements for jobs. So that was a little bit of the employment situation over the last decade or so, or actually last few decades. But here we're going to pivot to talk a little bit about the focal part of the report, which is higher education and the outcomes that are associated with it. So higher levels of educational attainment are associated with higher rates of labor force participation. That's essentially across the board. Higher rates of full-time hours and lower rates of unemployment. Similar to that, this shows the so-called higher education wage premium for full-time employed workers. We can see that for younger workers on the left side of the chart, higher levels of educational attainment are associated with higher earnings. And we see that gap grow as the workers age. The wage premium is relatively large. That's what this chart shows. But this chart shows that it's grown over time. This is average wages relative to a high school diploma. And this one actually adjusts for the changing demographics of the workforce over the last 4 decades, which have been pretty significant. But we see very large and rapid growth after 1980. But this growth starts to level off and slows in the late 2000s. And it's been essentially flat since then. I find this trend quite fascinating. I want to stress that it's not unique to Louisiana. This is a national trend. But nonetheless, it raises questions about the changing context of the supply and demand for workers with different educational and skills backgrounds. The rewards for higher education are still very significant, but they aren't growing the way that they once were. I also want to stress that these are averages. And to be clear, outcomes of higher education vary very widely. They vary by demographics, by family and geographic background, and they vary by degree, institution, and field of study. And I'll just give one example. This chart shows wages for men and women, and it shows the median wages and like the 75th percentile and the 25th percentile. And it shows essentially that at every level of education, if you look closely and kind of read across the chart, men earn higher wages at the median and especially at the higher end than women at the same level of education. So we have a big gap here, but this is the trend over time by degree level. If we go all the way back to the 80s, that was a pretty rough decade for Louisiana in terms of wage growth. But especially it was rough for men with lower levels of education that bore the brunt of that decade. And ever since, wage growth has been pretty flat for men, whereas it's grown a little bit for women, especially women at higher levels of educational attainment. So there's still big differences. That gap has closed a little bit. But these are the kinds of patterns that I think we'll have an opportunity to tease out with the data. And I'm going to kick it to Jenna now and kind of ask her. So we gave you a little bit of background on employment in Louisiana and outcomes of higher education. But can you tell us what's going on in terms of educational attainment in the post-secondary system?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to start with one more piece of background context about educational attainment. So this chart here shows rates of educational attainment for Louisiana workers aged 25 to 34. So kind of that early career segment from 1980, which is the bar at the bottom, up to 2021. So we had just seen on the chart Robbie showed a few slides back that the wage premium for education has more or less flattened in the past 15 or so years. But even so, educational attainment has continued to grow. And like Robbie was saying, this data is for Louisiana, but this trend is true nationally. So from a policy perspective, the Board of Regents has been really pushing on attainment. In 2019, they released a master plan with a goal that 60% of Louisiana adults have a degree or a high valued credential by 2030. The starting point in 2019 was 44% of adults that had a degree or credential. So to get to that 2030 goal, they knew that they needed to plan to basically double the number of credentials that they were awarding annually. one of the main strategies they're taking is a focus on what they call alternative pathways for people to get different types of credentials at different points in their career. So to kind of move beyond this idea of the high school grad going right into a bachelor's and then into their lifelong career. And this is a national thing of focus. There's a lot of research and investment across the US on these career-focused credentials. And one of our main data sources was the Board of Regents. We have a lot of data from them covering all of the degree and credential programs that they run. But one of the threads that sort of tied our research together this year was this focus on more attainable credentials. Okay, so let's actually talk about the LA First data. Everything we're going to be looking at from this point on is coming from the partnerships that Robbie described at the beginning, which for us in this report was the Board of Regents and what we called at the time of the report, the Louisiana Workforce Commission. Robbie has updated that slide to reflect that it's now called LA Works. I'm probably going to keep referring to it as the Louisiana Workforce Commission, and that's the name you'll see in the report. So forgive me as I update my mind on that one. Yeah, go ahead. So this chart is showing the mix of credentials that the Board of Regents awards. The bar on the left is from the earliest data that we have from the Board of Regents, which is the 2010 to 2011 academic year. And the bar on the right is the most recent year that we had, which is the 2023 to 2024 academic year. Over this time, the total number of credentials that were awarded by the Board of Regents grew, but you can see that the number of these more career-focused credentials, which is that lighter purple section at the bottom of the bars, has more than doubled as a proportion of all the credentials that the Board of Regents awards.
So Jenna, the all other in green up at the top, you would think just by reading that it would be like doctoral, but probably not. Oh, it is, you think?
Yeah, so it includes professional degrees, like law degrees, medical degrees. Yeah.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. Yeah.
And we're going to actually, we can see those specific categories on the next slide. Yeah, so this is just a bit more detail on the degrees and the credentials. And this is over time, it's annual completers by type of credential. And then it's also within each chart broken down by gender. So some of the main trends are that bachelors are the most common degree awarded. And then we see masters and associates are sort of a distant second. You can see some of the like all other professional, other post-degree certificates and stuff at the bottom. But we had focused quite a bit on the first two sections in the top corner, the career tech and the certificate credentials. And you can see they have a pretty steep growth in recent years. And you might also see in kind of in the middle that master's degrees show a similar pattern of growth. And we were really interested in that at first. We ended up having a conversation with the Board of Regents about it. And what we learned was that that is almost entirely reflecting a new online MBA program at LSU Shreveport. And it's a lot of people from other states and even like international students. But okay, so overall, we see that women are earning a lot more of most types of degrees and credentials than men are. And this matches the national picture that's true across the country. So you can go to the next slide, Robbie. Oh, here. Okay. So with the Board of Regents data, we are able to see the programs that people are in school. And so this chart shows some of that data also broken down by gender. Here we have associate and short-term credentials, and then bachelor's and master's. And what we see is that across the credential types, men and women are in many cases tending to pursue different fields of study. So for example, we see a lot more women in health and social science fields. And that's going to be good information to keep in mind in a couple of slides when we talk about employment outcomes. But before that, let's go ahead and talk about the linked data. So this diagram describes the record linking. That's sort of the core of the LA First concept. Like I mentioned a second ago, for the LEO report, we got data from the BOR and also from the Workforce Commission. So the Board of Regents data on the left-hand side includes anyone who completed a degree or credential at a Board of Regents institution. And from that data, we get the degree level and the program and some demographic stuff like race and gender. And so what's left out on the education side is anyone who is educated at another institution, whether it was a private university or it was somewhere outside of Louisiana. Then on the right-hand side with the Workforce Commission data, we get wages, we get industry, and we have some occupational data as well for people who worked in UI covered jobs, so jobs where you pay into unemployment insurance. So for the most part, that's the same as W-2 wage and salary jobs, and that excludes people who are self-employed, like small businesses, contractors, gig workers, and it also excludes all federal government workers. And we also, in the Workforce Commission data, don't see anyone who isn't working in Louisiana, whether it's that they're working in another state or that they're just not in the workforce. So what we're left with when we link these records is people who both went to a public school here and have a UI covered job here in Louisiana. So let's actually take a look at what we can do with some of this linked data. This chart shows a cohort of people who completed a degree or credential in the 2014 academic year, and we're looking at those people's median wages through 2023. So one of the things that stood out to us in these results was the really high earnings for men in this cohort who earned especially associate's degrees. By 2023, they were earning a median of $75,000 annually, while women with associate's degrees were earning about $47,000. And the median wage for these men with associate's degrees was even higher than for men with bachelors for this cohort. Men with bachelors were typically earning like $68,000 annually. And that even so is still a lot higher than what a woman with a bachelor's was earning, which was about $55,000 by 2023. So obviously these kinds of findings raise a lot of questions, but this is still a pretty high level wage outcome. And with the data we have, we can dig into a bit more detail. So Robbie, would you like to dive into some of that detail now?
Yeah, I will. Just before we get there, I do just want to add one additional note on that chart, and this is kind of a little way of previewing what we're looking into next year too. So that I think that's a really like somewhat surprising finding about that gap specifically for men who complete associates and other short-term degrees. But if we look very generally and publicly available data on every state's labor market, Louisiana is in the top handful of states in the size of its gender wage gap. And it's just measured like median wages and like the cents on the dollar that women make relative to men. So I think like that's an interesting pattern. Generally, we found something interesting specifically in this report. And can we connect the dots between those two outcomes? Because if it's something about how people sort themselves into degree programs and then into jobs afterward, that seems like a very relevant and interesting finding that we could pull out from this report. But I'm going to show a few case studies that's also an example of what we're going to be focusing on, and is really like, how we would tease down to that level of detail. So these are case studies of specific degree programs. For the report, we picked 4 degree programs. Again, this is a preliminary thing. These were kind of pilot analysis, but there was some logic to why we picked these. All 4 of these have relatively clear and well-defined pathways. We weren't looking at like philosophy majors and seeing their employment outcomes. These are pretty clear ones. We've got 2 healthcare and 2 construction-related pathways. These are, I think everybody in Louisiana knows that these are important, high-demand areas. We've got 2 that are mostly women, the nurses, and 2 that are mostly men, the HVAC and electrical and linemen programs. So I'm going to talk through these a little bit. We're really just going to focus on the nurses here, partly because the charts look nicer, but I think it kind of gives a good impression of where we're heading. So these are the occupational outcomes for those who complete LPN programs on the left and RN programs on the right. I know the writing's a little bit small here. I see you leaning in, Julie, to catch it. But this is essentially what this is looking at is like for everybody who completed a degree. I think it goes from 2014 to 2021. It's over a number of years, and then it's what occupations were they working in after their degree. And the good news is we find that for both of these programs, reliably, LPN and RN programs feed into the intended jobs that people were wanting to go into, presumably if they were choosing these educational pathways. 73% of the people who were working 7 years after completing their LPN degree were actually working in the LPN position. That's the people for whom we can see their occupation in the data. For RNs, it's about 76%. So these are relatively high levels of alignment. We see a few other details here. That purple wedge for the LPNs is people that completed an LPN credential and then some years later probably got some additional schooling and moved into an RN position. So it's kind of a career ladder, and that's evidence of career progression. We see that a little bit on the RN side because we see it's a blue wedge, nurse practitioners, anesthetists, and midwives. That could be a career progression for RNs. And then there's some other like healthcare management type jobs that we see in there too. So that's all good. Another thing that's kind of interesting here is that we see a lower rate of in-state retainment of the workers for the RNs, even though they're technically higher skilled workers. So that even 7 or 8 years later, about 75% of the LPNs were still earning a wage in state. That's very high retention rate. But for the RNs, it was a little under 60%. And it's a little bit tough to speculate on what the reasons are that might be. It might be that RNs are a little bit older. It very likely has something to do with RNs make more money working out of state in a lot of cases, and that might have been the pathway that some people opted for, and why that number shrinks over time in this data. So that's a bit of an interesting finding. This shows the wage numbers for those same two groups of workers, LPNs on the left, RNs on the right, and these are their median wages. We find that fairly quickly after completing their degree, RNs were approaching about $75,000 annually. That's about exactly what they would expect to be making based on the benchmark from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So that in itself is a good finding, because it means if you go into these programs and get this degree, you're making about the money that you were probably expecting to make. The same is true for LPNs. They were approaching about $50,000 later, more years out from their degree. So we see a pretty high correspondence with expectations here, and also with what we would expect based on the 2 degrees that we're looking at.
But so both of these, but certainly the RNs to a greater extent, seem to cap out at that initial rate of the 75,000 or 80,000. Am I reading that right? Yeah.
This is that's correct. Keep in mind, this is just the median, so there might be people at the 70th or 80th percentile where there's growth there. I think we'd expect to see that if we were looking at that too. Yeah, so this is the part sort of before year 0 on the left side of these charts is what they were making if they were working full time before they went back to get their degree. So the level of wage mobility is very high in this situation. It's the order of magnitude is like double or triple based on what they were earning before getting their degree. We see something a little bit similar when we look at the electrician and lineman programs and the HVAC programs. The electrician sort of gradually reached up towards 75,000, and that's kind of what you would expect because there's a few certification milestones associated with that job that are tied to experience. The HVAC didn't have as strong of wage outcomes, so that's a little bit interesting too. There was also a little bit less of that tight alignment between the job and the degree several years after getting it, but otherwise, for the most part, it was pretty similar. But just to put that level of wage mobility into perspective, this is more of a comprehensive scan of the labor market. So we've kind of got rid of the Board of Regents aspect of this. This is looking at wage mobility, and it's broken down by occupation. So this is a typical worker's wage mobility over an 8-year period if they were earning a wage in 2016 and 2023. That's the first year we have data and the most recent year of data we were working with. The blue dot is 2016, and it's broken down by each occupation. And then the purple dot is is the median earnings in 2023. And they might have changed occupations, but it's the same workers, what they were making in 2023. So we can see from this that lower earning workers actually had the highest wage mobility relative to their initial starting point. So food preparation, personal care, and sales jobs all had over 50% wage mobility over that 8-year period. That seems like very high wage mobility. In a lot of cases, they were changing jobs to get that level of wage mobility. But we also see lower levels of wage mobility for some jobs here. The one I like to point out is education, instruction, and library occupations. That's a lot of teachers, and there's very little wage mobility over that 8-year period for that group. Management isn't that high either. I think they were already making a pretty good amount of money to start with. But so from one perspective, there's a lot of wage mobility. But another takeaway from this chart is that the distribution of wages was pretty similar in 2023 for what the distribution was for those same workers in 2016, in the sense that we don't have a lot of people moving from low wage jobs all the way up to high wage jobs. So is it a lot or is it a little of wage mobility? It kind of depends on how you slice it. But getting at this level of detail is one of the really interesting things that we have an opportunity to do in these reports. This is kind of looking at that same group of workers, but this is about their persistence in the same occupation. And what we see is that for workers in those lower wage occupations, they were less likely to persist in the same occupations. A lot of them moved to other low wage occupations, but there was more movement there. However, they're also less likely to persist earning a wage at all in Louisiana than the middle and high earning workers were. So I know this is really very high level and very detailed at the same time. But what the picture we're trying to paint for you is a picture of mobility and tracking an individual through the course of their career through the labor market. And that's really is kind of the special thing about this data, especially if we're able to link it back to their experiences with education and training. So we'll just kind of close it out. This is the last slide. Close it out with some plans for the next report. And then I think we'll have a little bit of time for discussion. So the idea and real opportunity again here is to unpack the longitudinal aspect of the data, because we can capture not just the snapshot picture of employment, but employment and wage mobility. So that means not just a job outcome, but a career outcome. And not just a single number on a table or a talking point, but really something that's a little bit more of an informative, more dynamic, and more realistic story of employment in Louisiana. So the goal for the next report is to extend some of this case study logic, like we showed you the nurses, but extend that to a broader set of pathways through higher education, broader set of degree levels and broader set of instructional programs, and try to get to a more comprehensive picture of the outcomes of post-secondary education in Louisiana at some level of detail. We might pull out some case studies still, but we want to get a little bit of a comprehensive picture. Another goal is to better leverage the occupational information. So I showed that a little bit, showing like people who get an RN degree or working as an RN. This is actually a really unique aspect of the data that we have. Every state collects this kind of data through the unemployment insurance wage system. Louisiana is one of only a few states that collects the occupation with that. And that's really the important outcome, because you want to see if people are in the job that we would expect to be aligned with their degree program. So we've got some ideas on how to better leverage that data. And then finally, we just showed completions and then their outcomes. But people have a lot of pathways through higher education. They might transfer from a two-year to a 4-year degree. People might go from a 4-year to a master's. People might stop out. Just a huge diversity and range of those pathways. So we're trying to kind of get a read on what those pathways are to link their correspondence with career outcomes ultimately, because I think that that's kind of part of the story of how people, why and how people engage with higher education and what comes out on the other side in terms of employment. So that's just a little bit about what we found in the report. Hopefully that wasn't too much and you got a good picture, even though of sort of what we're finding very preliminarily, and also the direction where we're heading in the future.
Yeah, well, right off the bat, I feel compelled to ask if you could go back to the slides that show the gender wage gap. Because you've got women turning out in higher numbers than ever, and as compared to men, to get degrees, to achieve associate certificates, diplomas, masters, doctorates, but yet in their professions still making roughly what percent of what a man's making?
It depends on how you slice it, but it's in the 70 cents usually. 70 to 80.
Yeah. So your research did prove out what many are saying in terms of the wage gap, because it's always been about 67% that I've heard. Um, yeah. And you guys probably haven't yet tried to extrapolate any reasons for that.
I no, we don't have that. I think we'll try to get there for the next report. And Jenna, you might I might ask you to offer a little bit of an early finding on that. I think one thing that we'll see is that it is strongly related to the way that men and women sort into different occupations, and those occupations that tend to be predominantly male tend to pay more, whereas occupations that are predominantly female tend to pay less. Now, what are the reasons for that? How does society or the market reward skill? I think those are open questions, but at least in terms of the mechanism, that's kind of how you get from education to that big disparity in outcome.
Yeah, I know. I used to say, well, when I first got in the legislature, so, well, but women pick jobs that don't make as much money. And then somebody who's a member of our group now, I remember her saying, that's not it. It's that they don't pay those people, they don't pay those professions as well, because they looked at them as not having to make money, as much money, because they were married and they taken care of by their husband. And it's just something that the longer I look at it, the more issues I see with it, especially as women are just over achieving in higher ed.
Yeah, yeah. And going all the way back to those trends, from the 80s, part of those gains that were captured in the 80s and 90s were like women essentially breaking the barriers in some high-paying professional jobs that weren't necessarily accessible prior to those years.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things that's interesting, just looking at the data that we have in this presentation and not getting into anything that we might be able to do in the future, it's like one of the bigger growth areas was healthcare. And so it's like these women-dominated jobs are in a lot of ways very secure. We see a lot of investment in like STEM, which, it's all about getting women involved in the STEM jobs. But then there's like the mirror image of like, well, STEM might be a little unstable at this moment. I've been hearing a lot about layoffs, and then what's going on with all the growth in healthcare, and like there's other benefits to a job, I suppose.
Well, and then healthcare, if you go to that slide that shows RNs, it seemed like we're peeling off a lot of them, losing them to other states because their wages in Louisiana, for some reason, aren't keeping up with their wages in other states. Am I reading that right?
It's hard for us to positively say that that's what's going on, but it's likely that dynamic is in the mix somewhere here. Like Jenna said, this is one of the limitations. We can't see this. We can't see somebody who got the degree in Louisiana and then is working in Texas or working in Mississippi. There are little ways to tease that out with other data. It's going to be a little bit of something. I mean, we know that that's an important issue, and one that we want to highlight. So we're going to kind of figure out how to do it as best as we can.
Yeah, and I also hear Leslie mentioned in the chat burnout. And one of the groups that we want to dig into more at some point soon is teachers. And I wonder if we would also see a similar like indication of that trend.
Right, because we more or less know that our teachers are being paid less than the Southern regional average, right? And so would they also be leaving to go work in other states, especially if they live in a border area, if they live close to, let's just say, could Mississippi be paying more than Louisiana, or God forbid they're on the western side, I'm sure they can go to Texas. But yeah, it's a lot of interesting dynamics. And I mean, it just begs the question that I know that you can't answer based on this data project, but why? What makes us lag like that? I thought I would ask Robert and Jenna, like, what are the next steps for your research?
So this is an annual report. I'm not sure if I was totally clear about that at the start. And right now we're kind of working on the second year, which again means
Yeah.
a more comprehensive look. And we are planning to look at that issue of people moving out of state after completing at Board of Regents too. It's like it's a little tricky with the data, but we at least do want to provide something on that issue. This is an issue. I've done work on this issue previously, so has Jenna. I think we are pretty well positioned to at least nudge. We won't answer all the questions, but to at least nudge the needle a little bit on getting a little bit of clarity around that. And I think you're absolutely right in pointing that out. Like could be quality of life, could be cost of living, could be wages. It's probably all three. And then also social networks and culture and everything else that shapes where people end up moving to. So we'll try to say something a little bit on that issue. But that's kind of the goal, is to expand it. So like the next version of this presentation would be a little bit less of like here's a little taste of what we can do with the data, a little bit more like here's the situation for everybody in Louisiana who's completed a degree. And maybe pulling out some of these important, we know teachers and nurses are really important workforces, not just because the jobs are important, but because education and healthcare policy are important for their own reasons. But to also get at some of these questions about migration, because we know that that's on the top of everybody's mind.
Yeah. I mean, probably if I had to say, on this particular day on October 22nd, and it's 86 degrees outside, my first instinct says maybe people leave to go have a fall somewhere. But I do love my state, and I found great opportunity here. And I know that many of us on the phone call have found rich, rewarding careers and good quality of life. And hopefully we're all going to stay here and make Louisiana just continue to improve and improve. And Robert and Jenna, just thank you so much for sharing your time with us today and showing us the important work you're doing over there at the Blanco Center. Conversations like this are really what Ellevate Louisiana is about. We're passionate about aligning our education and workforce systems. We want to see upward mobility for our citizens, expanded opportunity, and also one of our big banners is quality of life, to see an improvement in that across our state. So to all of you on the call, our speakers, thank you so much. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us and being part of the discussion. And I hope everyone has a great day. And I do hear that we're going to get a wee taste of fall in the next couple of days. So hope everybody has a lovely weekend.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, guys. If you're interested in these types of policy talks, check us out on Ellevate Louisiana's website, where you can learn more about our events, our policy committees, advocacy efforts, and how to join. That